but I'm hoping to, in this presentation, go through why this is a different, related aspect of this debates about methods and where innovation is taking us. So just to kick off, first of all, with pluralism, in a useful book by Greg McLennan, he talks about what pluralism is and says it's got its proponents and critics. Its proponents see pluralism as an acknowledgement of multiplicity and difference, endorsement of different ways of knowing, suitably humble and relativistic acceptance of the range of cultural values, whereas to critics, pluralists are people who lack a coherent organising paradigm, and they're the sort of people who do not really have clear opinions on anything. So not everyone is in favour of pluralism. In terms of methodological pluralism, McLennan notes that proponents of pluralism regard pluralism as leading to methodological diversity, and in the 1970s there was an extensive debate about the values of methodological pluralism, and Bell and Newby argued that we need to recognise that it's no longer appropriate to think about there being only one style of social research with one method that is to be the method, rather there are many. And they were making this argument in the context of extensive and ongoing debates about claims being made about the superiority of some methodological innovations. And Scott and Marshall, in their Dictionary of Sociology, talk about methodological pluralism as a rejection of methodological exclusiveness and the related idea that there's only one style of social research. And the proponents of methodological pluralism contrast it with different ways of talking about the other position. So one of those ways of referring to that is methodological exclusivism, and that's Bell and Newby talking about that view that's held by people who feel that they've got the right method. Other people talk about methodological closure or methodological tribalism. And so there's some fairly sort of harsh points of contrast, saying either we're pluralist or we are tribal and exclusive and some closure. But for critics of methodological pluralism, they say, well, really what you're proposing is method slurring, and they also contest this idea that all methods are equal. Just a bit of historical background. So I guess that we all have some familiarity with the history of the development of social science research methods. And it's been established for a long time that there is a plurality of methods available to us. Just in this and coming slides, picked on 4 textbooks, which this first one goes right back to the 1930s, when the Webbs talked about the variety of methods that they'd used in their research in different studies. By the 1950s, John Madge was talking about documents, observation, interviews and experiments, and making the point that no single technique is adequate for the grasp of a situation of any depth and complexity. So these are textbooks, and I guess you'd expect textbooks to be pluralistic in this way, talking about the variety of methods that are available to us. But this is not a new area of debate in this sense of there being a variety of different methods available. By the 1960s, Margaret Stacey was making a more extensive claim and saying not only are there different methods available to us, but she's saying that most sorts of social research need more than one method. That if we're going to grasp things, and in her case she was reporting on a community study conducted in Banbury, and she had found that to get at the nature of social status and social change in Banbury, she needed to use a variety of methods. And in her book she lists their documents, observation, asking questions, surveys, and what she calls combined operations. And then the 4th textbook I've selected, just really to kind of show that these are recurring themes throughout the decades. Catherine Hacken's book identified 8 main types of study, and I've listed them here on the slide. And she's got this comment that all of them have strengths and limitations. So there's a long-standing recognition that there's a plurality of methods available to us as social researchers, And it's established enough for there to be a recognisable progress narrative whereby the developments there are in methods available to us just keep on being added to, and we are characterising our situation by ever more opportunities for the use of creativity in combining these different methods. And so this is Perti al-Satari and his colleagues saying that there is this progress narrative about how in the old days there was just a relatively small number of methods available to us, and now we have a great wealth of approaches to adopt. But they go on to make the point that the reality is more complicated, and it isn't simply that we've left behind restriction and are now celebrating plurality of opportunities, because traditions may vary across societies and also are subject to fashion. Going back to the 1970s, Bella Newby's book, doing sociological research, was written in the context of paradigm wars in which people were extremely robust and indeed went beyond the usual kind of courtesies of academic debate, and they were arguing for a ceasefire in these paradigm wars and getting beyond what had become a very polarised debate about are you quantitative or qualitative. And Martin Buber described the situation as one in which those at either end of the qualitative continuum displayed an intolerance, indeed bigotry, towards styles of research which do not accord with their own view of proper procedure. So the period of paradigm wars is one that I grew up in as a student. I can remember trying to sort of navigate my way around that particular set of issues, but it wasn't a particularly conducive place to be. It was a context in which there was a great deal of side-taking required. People would ask you, which side are you on? I don't intend to go over that in great depth, not least because it's been very well written about by a number of people. In particular, Alan Bryman has written a number of things on paradigm wars, and I particularly recommend this article, which is in the references at the end of the presentation. But Williams and Voigt look back on paradigm wars and say, we don't want to go back there. This was a pointless, damaging episode in social research. But although we can say, well, we've left paradigm wars behind, they also note that this fundamental issue about how we know the social world has the potential to re-emerge, and that not everybody is now persuaded of methodological pluralism, or what they call methodological ecumenism. And that religious language will be relevant in a moment. So Bryman himself had made the point, and this was something that Alan Bryman spent a couple of decades of his career writing about and exploring about the potential for quantitative and qualitative research to achieve some sort of détente, as he puts it, but also some scope for the exploration of engagement across that divide and moving beyond that divide. But he himself said as well that he was aware that paradigm wars hadn't entirely disappeared. The chapter that's referred to there is called The End of Paradigm Wars, ? And what he says is that there is this potential that he's aware of, and that there are signs that paradigm wars may re-emerge through other debates. And in particular, paradigm wars don't have to be qualitative versus quantitative. There is potential that Bryman was already picking up a decade ago for some fairly heated controversies to be developing between different types of qualitative researchers. So he's saying here there are signs that the paradigm wars have not entirely disappeared, but have resurfaced in different ways. And an article by Lamont and Swidler develops this theme, and they are particularly kind of interested in exploring how it's come about that in a field in which they work, so these are both interview-based qualitative researchers find themselves and their fellow interview researchers under some attack from people from other qualitative perspectives, in particular from ethnographers. And they feel that it's important to put out there the case for methodological pluralism, because they get a sense that some people are reviving this view that they can identify the method they're using not only as different but better, and they can use that position to be critical of the credibility of other people's approaches. So they offer an interesting and I find persuasive defence of interviewing against the challenges of ethnographers and others who they say are entitled to a different point of view, which is a pluralist position. But what they say is it doesn't have to be a debate which is characterised by sectarian methodological fights. And in particular, one of the things that they object to is the way in which they find the position of their own type of work being misrepresented. And they say when people who are critical of interviews, we find that quite often they talk about a particular type of interviewing and approach it from the point of view that the critics have rediscovered or have discovered some rock-bottom truth that their method has captured and that other methods are not able to capture. And what they say is that this is a very selective focus. They don't recognise contemporary interviewing in these characterisations. There's a focus in these critical attacks on old and new, and this does have some resonation with the paradigm wars of the 1960s, 70s and 1980s. Just to give you a flavour of what it was like in the 1970s, there was a group of people working in the research paradigm that was aiming to be participatory, and this new paradigm research group manifesto put forward in fairly uncompromising language about the case for a new paradigm and the shortcomings of the old paradigm. And the old paradigm suffered from being one-sided in its obsession with objectivity, in contrast with the new research paradigm, which involves a much closer relationship than that which is usual between the researcher and the researched. And they talk about the right kind of research being superior to the wrong kind of research. So I've put that in just because what the contemporary debates are referring back to was a period when people did have some very blunt and stark views about there being right and wrong ways of doing social research. And if that was true of the 1970s, we can also look at some of the recent work based on the participatory turn, in which a similar set of claims are being made about a new knowledge landscape which is superior and which is founded on a new way of doing things, which finds conventional research as problematic in the way in which the research has gone about, because it's insufficiently inclusive, insufficiently democratic, and insufficiently prepared to kind of recognise that the case for getting a material must involve a fight. So there's lots of kind of rather pugilistic language, and some of you who know the writers in these fields will know that one of the characters is Loic Waquant, who himself has studied boxing, and I think he's kind of brought that over into some of these discussions. But in the contemporary discussions about co-production, I'm somewhat disappointed to find that the case for co-production as the basis for a new knowledge landscape brackets other groups of researchers who do things differently as positivists, and this I think is sort of one of the problems that was there in the paradigm was of rather simplistic name calling. So I put a reference there to just an example whereby there's our way of doing things and this is better than the positivists. So if we look historically, advocating one correct way of proceeding methodologically, I would say has a poor record. And certainly Howard Becker had his complaints a long time ago about the way in which he found methodologists had a capacity to proselytize and to preach a right way to do things. And this religious language is, I think, quite interesting because it also comes out in Lamont and Swidler's points about their objections to what they call sectarian methodological fights. And Becker saw this very much as kind of a position that was developed on the basis of having a fundamental belief in the rightness of the approach rather than it being demonstrated by outputs. And so Becker is sceptical whenever he heard Becker, he's still alive, but Becker would be sceptical of the case when it's made about adopt this method and it will take us to salvation. So methodological pluralism as a perspective rests on acknowledging that our methods all have blind spots. When there's not the claim there that this is the perfect method. Any method has, as we saw in the earlier slide by Catherine Hackin, has strengths and limitations. And this is not a comment made particularly in relation to methods, but I find I use it a lot. It's by Maxine Rodinson when he says, no one has a key to fit all the locks. This is a very pragmatic perspective. In other words, what is underlying pluralism, methodological pluralism, is the view that we employ the methods that we do according to the task in hand, and the justification is primarily about the types of results that they produce, rather than agendas being produced by research purists who have a particular exclusive epistemology. So Lamont and Swidler talk about building bridges rather than digging deep moats is the key to fostering a strong field, and they talk about pluralistic coexistence, fostering dialogue and innovative methodological cross-fertilization in the spirit of openness and constructive criticism. So they're not against debate. A pluralist is not saying we don't want to have contestation here, but they are saying there should be some ground rules about the types of contributions to this debate that there are. And they contrast that with and that can be contrasted with the position which Kirsten Luca has characterized as people, when you tell them about your research, they assume that you're doing what they're doing only badly because you haven't used the method that they use. I just want to give one example of what can come out of this potential for constructive dialogue. This is a book by Daniel Nettle called Tyneside Neighbourhoods, and it's based on a really interesting combination of methods, ethnography and experiments. And when I read this book, I was blown away because I thought, well, I would never think about putting those two methods together. But and I was kind of skeptical when I started the book that it would be carried off. But actually, on the basis of what's there in the material, and on the basis of the other work that Daniel and his colleagues have done in Newcastle, I'm persuaded that ethnography combined with experiments is better than either method on their own. And it's very much driven by his view that we need to get beyond this either quantitative or qualitative divide. And I put a reference to the book in the references, but also to a conversation between Daniel and Sam Hilliard, where they were filmed talking for 20 minutes about what happened when you combine two very different methods in a creative way, as they have done there. They also have some very good maps, which don't quite fit with the ones we got from Danny, but nevertheless they are very instructive about patterns of inequality within times. So such examples of researchers putting methodological pluralism into practice are doing more than one concern, which was Jeff Payne and his colleagues writing about methodological pluralism said, well, we might be pluralistic in principle, but are there examples of people who are combining very different types of methods? And it's cases like the Newcastle study that allow us to have confidence that methodological pluralism can be put into practice rather than simply are all being comfortable with there being a diversity of methods. Whether that will become more common is clearly based on a number of things. It's based in part on the training that's available, and the training landscape is changing all the time, of course. It's based on a number of other contextual factors, about things like career paths and so on, because as we know, it is still very difficult for people to pursue genuinely interdisciplinary careers, and one of the things that characterises pluralism is the preparedness to cross disciplinary boundaries. And academic discipline also matters. I've referred a lot above to sociology because I think probably sociologists, and I am a sociologist, are particularly prone to this type of disputatiousness about methods. So I think the paradigm wars probably were dominated by sociologists more than by any other discipline, and I say that with no pride, quite the reverse. But as we move into a more interdisciplinary environment, so that may be one thing that will reduce the pressures or the roots that there are of methodological intolerance that led to the paradigm wars. And Lamont, in a separate study, found in talking to people across a range of 12 different disciplines of assessors, so it's a book called How Professors Think, and looked at how people make judgments about assessing research applications. And she found that across these 12 different disciplines, the predominant view was that different methods serve different purposes, and there's a value in having a range, a plurality of methods available. And last but not least, if we're thinking about what promotes or holds back methodological pluralism, there's also the question of attitude, with which I began in Greg McLennan's quote, that pluralists have an element of humility. They don't necessarily think that they have all the answers to things. And if we're looking for a final argument as to why we might more appropriately be pluralists than taking another position, it's provided by Kirsten Luke with this quote, which is my take-home message. You cannot afford to snooch methods that can be very useful to you in their place. So, thanks very much.